Welcome to round two, the quarterfinals of me trying to rank my favorite and least favorite tours that I've ever been on. Now, just in case you didn't catch the first opening round of this, I'll throw a card up here that you can click and go check it out. But if you don't want to watch an entire video and you just want to start here, I'll just give you a quick recap. I always get the question, what's my favorite tour that I've ever worked on in my life? Because I've been a roadie for the past 15 years, and it's a hard question to answer because I've liked a lot of different tours for a lot of different reasons. So I decided to do this video where I've put all of the bands I've toured with, well, at least the top 16 bands. I put them in a tournament bracket. I'm talking about what I liked, what I didn't like, and I'm advancing them on. And today, we're on to the next round. We have 8 bands left that we're going to talk about. We're going to move on 4, and then we're going to keep going after that. So sit back, relax, enjoy round 2, and probably a little more story time from each tour. So our first matchup for the quarterfinals is the number 1 seeded Foo Fighters against the number 8 seeded Pat Banatar. And as always, we start at the lower seed first. So let's talk about Pat. Now, I guess I'm incorrect in just saying Pat Banatar, but that's the name everybody knows because as of when I started working for them over 10 years ago, they were professionally billed as Pat Banatar and Neil Giraldo. For anybody wondering about Neil is actually her husband, who she's been married to since, I believe, the early 80s. Now, he's also her guitar player that's been with her since the beginning and the producer that's worked on most of their stuff. Neil's actually super, super talented. Not only, in my opinion, is he one of the most underrated guitar players in rock music, but he's also written songs and produced a lot of other acts as well. But now that Pat is later on in her career, she wanted to have his name alongside hers on the marquee and on tour posters and stuff like that. So we talked about this tour a little bit in the last video, and I actually did multiple tours with these guys. I originally met them because they were the opener on tour with Journey, and I was the assistant merchandise manager for Journey. And I was asked by the company that did the merch to also handle the merchandise for Pat Banatar, which I did. And I got to know them and I got to know their crew. And super long story short, by the end of this tour, they wanted me to continue on touring with them, to come out with them full time anytime they toured, and handle all of their merchandise on tour. And I was happy to do that because I really enjoyed being around them. And this tour for me was just awesome, man. I mean, I first met them in 2012, and I did every single tour that they did until 2015 when I moved on to more guitar teching and drum teching and stuff like that. And we worked pretty heavily throughout the year. We'd probably do 2 or 3 tours a year, and then I'd have some home time or I'd go work for other bands in between. But this really was a great family vibe, man. I mean, I had great times with her band and the rest of the crew. Some of these crew members are people that I still talk to today, that I made very good friends with. People that I learned a lot of stuff from as well, man. There were some great industry veterans on this tour that I really got to grow up around because when I first started touring with Pat, I was 23, I think. So I was pretty young, you know, I was a cocky kid, thought I knew everything, and I learned a lot. I had some great times out here. I had birthdays out on the road, and I had a very specific one I'll never forget. It was in Bakersfield, California. Pat and her husband had their assistant grab me a birthday cake for my birthday, and we all celebrated my birthday on the road. And it was just little moments like that are just such super cool things and, you know, memories for a lifetime and stuff like that. I can't think of any crazy specific stories off the top of my head right now, but we had a lot of partying on days off. We had a lot of fun times, a lot of travel around North America. And this tour and this band and Pat and her husband are very special to me. It meant a lot. And, you know, it's going to be very hard to beat. Now, moving on to the number 1 seed, Foo Fighters. Some of you are probably thinking this is going to be a very interesting decision because we're just thinking in terms of sizes of bands. But it's really not, because as I talked about in the first video, on a technicality, I wasn't really touring with the Foo Fighters, but I was at the same time. Long story short, I wasn't a part of their actual shows. I was part of a team that went to cities that they were playing in on their stadium tour ahead of time. And we set up Foo Fighters retail stores and we sold merchandise for a week before the show. And then we'd close down the day of the show, and then we'd all go to the show and hang out and stuff like that. And I did quite a few of the cities on this run, man. And there were times where I couldn't do certain dates because I was going to do different tours, but we were really taken care of. We stayed in really cool locations and really cool cities. We stayed in New York City for a week where, you know, every night after we'd close down the store, we'd go out for food and drinks and hang out. And it was a really good time. We also did one in Chicago and some other places. And it allowed me to meet some really cool people, man. One of the guys that I was working with, I didn't know before we started, and we had a great friendship and worked together great. And he was really cool. And then another guy that we brought on board was somebody that I had known from years prior, but we had never worked together. And when they asked me if we wanted to get another person to help at the stores, I called this guy and he did it. And he's awesome. And we still to this day talk, and we're really good friends. He, in my opinion, is one of the most seasoned like road dogs I've ever met. And he's still touring right now. And this one for me is just more about the fun times and the hangs that I had with them doing the retail store and the merchandise and all that. And I got to be honest, I'm going to pick Pat Benatar on this one easily over the Foo Fighters just because of the memories that I have from the Pat Benatar tour and how they treated me and how much time I spent around them and their band and the crew and stuff like that. This one is fairly easy, but I don't know how Pat's going to do in the next round. But for this round, Pat Benatar and Neil Giraldo, moving on. So for the next matchup, we have the number 5 seeded Nick Jonas against the number 4 seeded Van Halen. So starting at Nick Jonas, this was a tour that I did merchandise on for one tour back in about 2014. This was actually the tour that I came home from like 3 days before I got married, man. So it brings up funny memories of that, of finishing this tour and going home, but it was super fun, man. The crew on this one was great all around. Guys that I worked with later on down the line, our drum tech on this one was a drum tech on Dustin Lynch with me. The tour manager on this tour is still a friend today who is now a manager in the music industry and manages bands. And there's other people in this crew that I see on the road from time to time, and it was really fun. And for me, I think this one was the most fun part about this tour for me was the hangs. While I got to know the band, I had minimal interaction with Nick. But all the times I did talk to Nick, he was very nice. Very quiet, but very nice and respectful. He's a good dude. I enjoyed it. But this is all about fun times, man. On days off with this crew, we'd go to bowling alleys and drink and hang out and stuff. We'd go to go-kart tracks and have fun on days off. This was just a fun tour. Not necessarily anything like crazy or life-changing or anything like that. It was just loads of fun. But going to the number 4 seed, Van Halen, this one was also loads of fun, but I learned a lot. This was a tour that I took at a very young age, and it was really the first time that I was on something that, as I said in the first video, was larger than life. I came out onto this tour thinking I knew everything. I was this cocky young kid, and I realized very quick, I didn't know how the music industry in terms of being a roadie and touring actually worked, man. I didn't really have a lot of respect, and I learned very quick and very hard from a lot of the seasoned veterans that were on this tour. Some of the people on this tour had worked for Van Halen like in the 70s and 80s and stuff like that. People that have been around them forever. But there was a lot of great people out here. A lot of you guys know that I use JH audio in-ears when I listen to videos. You can clearly see them. Well, JH stands for Jerry Harvey, who was one of the monitor engineers on the Van Halen tour. That's how I met him. He is actually credited as creating the first in-ear monitor, and he did it for Alex Van Halen. He wanted to get something better than over-ear headphones or monitors so that Alex could hear everything better, and he didn't have to struggle with monitors or headphones or anything like that. And that's pretty much how the in-ear monitor was really born in terms of how it's used in the touring music industry. We also had a lot of other people that, you know, are just legends in terms of touring that did things that at the time I didn't understand, but I do now. My first day on this tour ever, I got locked in our merch semi because when Van Halen's show was starting, their production manager came to the docks and closed the gate on me. He knew I was in there. He saw me. And at the time I was like, what a fucking asshole. You know, like I didn't get it. Later, this is one of those moments where I found out how picky artists could be. I found out that David Lee Roth, the vocalist for Van Halen, like I needed to say that, you guys know. I found out that he has a big thing about like drafts and breezes coming into the arenas, like while they're getting ready to play and perform and stuff. So they had a protocol on their tour that when Van Halen was going on stage, everything backstage wise had to be pretty much locked down. Nobody could go in or out of doors and into trucks through the bay doors. So they closed all the bay doors and I got stuck inside of a truck for pretty much their entire show. And it's funny to think back now about that, but one of those big learning moments where I had to learn about the little tiny things on each tour that I didn't know about. But going back to the reason I love this tour, aside from the learning moments, was the hangs, man. I mean, we had such fun days off with the crew on this, man. And while it was difficult for me at first on this tour to really get to know people and get started, I was really welcomed in after I kind of grew up a little. And a lot of these older people that are seasoned veterans in the industry really kind of took me under their wings or in their arms or whatever and just kind of let me hang around and brought me out with them and stuff. And it was just a very cool experience that I don't think I'll ever be able to replicate with anything. And because of everything that I just mentioned, Van Halen, with no doubt in my mind, is going on to the next round over Nick Jonas. Moving on to our next matchup, we have the number 6 seeded Dustin Lynch against the number 3 seeded Nickelback. Now, Dustin Lynch might not be a name that anybody knows because a lot of people that watch this channel are into rock and metal and stuff, but Dustin is a country artist that grew up just south of Nashville, Tennessee. And when I actually got offered this tour, I didn't know who he was. I had never heard of the guy in my life, ever. And it was funny how I got this because I was on another tour that I absolutely hated, that is not a part of this bracket at all. And I was so miserable on that tour that I texted a friend and was like, do you know of anything that's available? Because I'm miserable. And he's like, yeah, there's a guy named Dustin Lynch looking for guitar tech. I'll pass your information on to the production manager. Super long story short, I got hired for this gig. And this was the first gig that I was actually a full-time guitar tech on, because prior to this, I had been a bass and a drum tech. But when I started with Dustin, it was a small crew. It was a smaller operation because he was new. And I was teching everybody. I was helping set up drums. I was teching the bass player, all of the guitar players, not just Dustin. But as we grew, it eventually got to the point where I was only guitar teching for Dustin and one of his guitar players, Chris. But this tour for me, man, while country isn't really my thing, musically and culturally, I didn't like a lot of the stuff that happens in the country industry. This is one of the most important tours for me that I've ever done because it really taught me a lot. I probably learned more about being a guitar tech and more about guitars and amps on this tour than anything else I've ever done. And there was a lot of wild stuff that happened in terms of life experiences on this one for me, man. I mean, as I've talked about before, this is the tour that I got sober on. Super long story short, I used to have a pretty gnarly alcohol problem. I got drunk while we were in Mexico for a festival and actually physically assaulted one of his managers. And then, again, long story short, somehow that guy got fired and I didn't. But that was the last time I ever drank. That was one of those moments where I was just like, I have a problem and I need to stop. And they were super supportive of it, man. Without some of the people on this crew, I don't know if I would have been able to stay sober in those early months of trying not to drink and stuff like that. But other than that, the people were great, man. I mean, I loved working for Dustin. I loved his team. His tour management was great. We had our ups and downs with different crew members, but eventually they were replaced with other people. But they were always very open and inviting. Like they let my wife Claire come out to a lot of shows on days off in town. A lot of the band members and crew members would hang out with their wives and we were invited to stuff. It was just a fun atmosphere, man. But overall, this one to me is very important because of some of the touring opportunities I had. I mean, some of the biggest shows I've ever done in my entire life were on this tour, whether they were festivals or overseas or opening for another artist. And I learned a lot. I had a good time. I had a lot of big life changes, and it's a very important tour for me. Now going to the number 3 seed, that is Nickelback. I talked a little about this on the last video, but Nickelback was a tour that I actually came onto as a fill-in merchandise manager. I was an assistant. This was the first tour that I ever did coming out of, like a lot of Christian rock bands and stuff where I was kind of overwhelmed. I was like, I can't believe I'm on this tour. Like, Nickelback was huge at the time, and it was all, you know, huge, massive arenas and stuff like that. And it was fun. It was super fun, but I probably didn't have as much fun as I could have because I was nervous. I wasn't used to being on the road in settings like this yet, so I was kind of quiet and kept to myself and stuff like that. But we did have some awesome times. On days off, for example, we'd go out with the crew, and some of the Nickelback band members would hit up the crew and then meet us at bars, and we'd all hang out. Even some of the openers, like the guys from Seether, would come out and hang out all the time, and we just had fun out at the pub on days off. After show parties were always a blast and stuff. But for me, this one honestly doesn't match up to any of the times that I ever had with Dustin Lynch. It was a great tour. It was fun. I made some friends. I had good times. But because of all the life experiences and some of the memories on the Dustin Lynch tour, I've got to move on Dustin Lynch to the next round on this one. For sure, without a doubt. So going on to the last matchup of this round, we have the number 15 seed Red against the number 7 seeded Lifehouse. Now, Red was the first band that I ever worked for. Like, they gave me my shot at being a roadie. And when I was originally hired, it was to be a merchandise manager and a lighting director. And a lighting director is the person that actually runs the lights for the show for the band while they're performing. And the reason I got into that was because they used to take my band on the road with them at times. And there was a moment where they had a really bad lighting director, not touring with them, but in a venue, because they didn't have a lighting director at the time. And their tour manager happened to mention, I wish somebody on this tour knew how to do lights. And I did, because I worked at a club venue when we were home, and I told him, and he's like, oh, you want to run our lights? So they started bringing my band on tour to do lights for them. And then when I quit my band, they hired me to do that and merchandise. I have a lot of great memories from this tour. It was fun. I still talk to the guys here and there, but I had a lot of learning moments that came out of bad situations. This was a tour that I really learned the hard way that I have to say no sometimes. Because when I first started working for them, like I said, I was just the lighting director and merchandise manager, but they kept asking me if I would do stuff. And me being the young gun and wanting to please everybody and work hard, I just kept saying yes. So eventually I started bass teching. Then I started drum teching. Then I started doing pyrotechnics and special effects. And I got to a point where I was so overloaded that I was miserable. And it started affecting my relationship with them. I was very testy and very short and kind of aggravated all the time. And eventually we were on a tour that kind of boiled down to a situation where I kind of got into an argument with their bass player over some gear-related stuff during a show. And at the end of the show, I mean, if nobody was there, we probably would have gotten into a fight with each other. And that was the moment where I decided I just need to step away from this and find somebody else to work with. And then, as I talked about in the last video, they fired me before we even got home. So depending on who you talk to, I quit, I got fired, I don't know. But either way, it was a huge learning experience. And I did a lot of cool stuff with these guys, man. We had fun days on days off. They're a really cool band. They had great crew guys working with them. Crew guys that I still see from time to time now. I mean, one of their guitar techs was the original guitar player for Paramore, and he's now guitar teching for Florida Georgia Line. And then their drummer, Joe, eventually went on to go drum for In Flames for a minute. And everybody's done a lot of cool stuff. Now, moving on to the number 7 seed, Lifehouse. Lifehouse was an interesting one because when I got the offer, I hadn't heard anything about Lifehouse in years, and I didn't know if they were still relevant. But they said that they were going to do a world tour, and I had never gone fully around the globe on a tour yet, and I absolutely wanted to do it. So the first stretch with these guys was supposed to be opening for Nickelback, who I have toured with. So when we got to that first show of that tour, I got to see a lot of people I hadn't seen in a while and was really excited for that tour. And then it got canceled the first day before one performance. It was the tour that Chad had a really serious throat issue and had to have vocal surgery and all that stuff. So it got canceled. And then in the meantime, I went and did another tour and then came back when we started our world tour. Now, the band with these guys is great. I loved these guys. This was one of those situations where there really was no separation. We were around each other at all times. We became really good friends, especially the two that I was working for, their drummer and their bass player. And the crew was awesome as well, man. We started out this tour in Europe. Where was our first show? I can't even remember. I feel like we flew into Amsterdam. That's usually where everybody flies into. But we did a tour in Europe, then we did shows in the UK, and this is where my notorious Oktoberfest in Germany story comes from, which I may retell one day. I don't know, because it's embarrassing and it's wild. But after we did the European tour, we flew to the Philippines and did shows there. Then we flew to Australia, New Zealand, and it was just the experience overall for me. On this tour, it felt like, working for another band. Like I said, I like the guys, but I haven't really kept up with them that much. Some of the crew guys on this tour I do, but this one for me is just the experience of going around the globe, and it was just so cool, man. And the band took care of us and we were paid well. And this decision is a little more difficult than I thought it would be, considering the memories I have working for Red, and they were the first band that brought me on tour. But I really got to move Lifehouse on to the next round for this one, because in terms of favorite tours, I would put this up there because, again, made awesome memories, traveled the globe, and have been to places that a lot of people haven't. And I have memories that I'll never forget. So, Lifehouse, moving on to the next round. And there we have it. 4 more bands moving on into the semifinals of this bracket. 4 more bands that are stuck in the quarterfinals. But I would like to say every band in this round, I really did like a lot. And I liked touring with. But on the next video, we're going to be checking out Pat Banatar up against Van Halen. And then Dustin Lynch up against Lifehouse. And to be honest, I'll probably do the semifinals and finals in one video, so we don't just have more videos of sitting around. And maybe I'll pick my favorite stories from each one of these tours to talk about, since we've already talked about the basics and what I did and how I got on it and stuff like that. But this is super fun, again, because I've never sat down and really thought about this or talked about this before. And I'd be willing to bet that these 4 bands that are in the semifinal would have been top answers anyways if somebody just asked me. But it's going to get really interesting with a few of these matchups to really decide what tour that I actually liked more. So thank you guys for watching. And just out of curiosity, if there's anything you'd like to hear in the next video in terms of those 4 bands that are left, let me know in the comments, and maybe I'll come up with some stories and talk about specific things that you guys would like to know and just make this a little more interesting. But until then, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed talking about it. And I'll see you guys soon for the semifinal and final round of my favorite and least favorite tours that I've ever been on.